right. Welcome everyone to Splendid Wake IX on a scorching Sunday afternoon in the nation's capital. I am Henry Crawford, and before we begin, let's recognize Ian Sidney March for that musical interlude that preceded today's program. He's been doing this now for Splendid Wake for a couple of years in our live and in our Zooms. So it's a pleasant way to open our program. So thank you, Sidney. This afternoon, I'll be leading us on a journey celebrating DC's poetic history and honoring its past and present seers and visionaries. The idea behind Splendid Wake is to memorialize the work of poets who have lived, worked, volunteered, or been active in a group in the DC metro area. Our goal is to ultimately celebrate the depth and breadth of DC's literary communities. This year, we'll be highlighting the work of Lou and Will Stovall, and we'll have a presentation by Marilyn Poet Laureate Grace Cavalieri, who will be honoring the poet John McNally with a tribute, as well as taking us on a retrospective of her renowned poetry program from the Library of Congress, The Poet and the Poem. Finally, noted poet and author Kim Roberts will be sharing her deep knowledge of poetry in the DC area with a presentation on her book, By Broad Potomac's Shore, Great Poems from the Early Days of Our Nation's Capital. But before we get started, it is our tradition to honor those poets who have passed away since our last Splendid Wake program. Each of these poets and writers have produced a wide collection of works in all sorts of styles and forms. For our purposes today, I will name them and mention a single work for each of the writers. So let's begin now with the in memoriam portion of the program. Richard McCann. He was a longtime professor of creative writing at American University and the author of Ghost Letters, which won the 1994 Beatrice Hawley and Capricorn Poetry Awards. Judith Farr, author of the 2019 collection, What Lies Beyond, which was inspired by her beloved Emily Dickinson. Venus Thrash, who was co-editor of Beltway Poetry Quarterly and co-director of the WordWorks Joaquin Miller reading series, and author of The Fateful Apple in 2014, which was nominated for the 2015 PEN American Open Book Award. Judy Neary was editor of the newsletter of the Maryland Federation of Teachers and the author of the 2008 collection, Always the Trains, Poems. Greg Tate. He was the godfather of hip-hop journalism with an inventive writing style, who often wrote as a crucial voice on Black culture and aesthetics. Askaya Mohammed, who was the news director for WPFW-FM, a journalist for the Washington Informer for 4 decades, and the author of the 2007 collection, African Affirmations, Songs for Patriots. And lastly, we have Faye S. Moskowitz. Faye was a longtime professor of English at George Washington University and the author of Peace in the House, Tales from a Yiddish Kitchen, published in 2003. These fine poets have left behind for us a treasure trove of wise and wondrous works. They will be missed by all. So now we turn to our presentations. Our first presenters are a pair of multi-talented artists, Lou and Will Stovall. Lou Stovall was born in Athens, Georgia in 1937 and grew up in Springfield, Massachusetts. He studied at the Rhode Island School of Design and graduated with a BFA from Howard University. He has lived and worked in Washington, D.C. since 1962. His prints and drawings are a part of numerous public and private collections throughout the world. His work is the subject of an upcoming exhibition at the Phillips Collection, which opens on July 23rd, 2022. His son, Will Stovall, is an artist who holds a PhD from Yale University and is currently a candidate for an MFA in painting at Bard College. He is the editor of the book Of the Land, The Art and Poetry of Lou Stovall, An exhibition of his work opens at the Hom Gallery in DC in August. Okay, Lou, Will, tell us about your lives and your work.
Well, thank you so much, Henry. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sydney. I love the Lloyd McNeil tribute too. That's wonderful. I should say, for those maybe don't know, Lloyd McNeil was a collaborator with my dad in the visual arts and also in organizing exhibits in the late 60s. And so it's community posters that they started making together in early 1967 for everything from jazz concerts to DC's first public local election for school board in November 68 to arena stage in 68, 69. So really covering the whole landscape of Washington, DC at the time. And the book, which we have here, Of the Land, that was published February this year, Of the Land, the Art and Poetry of Lou Stovall, tells a story of all this work in the late 60s, early 70s, downtown and various places in DC, U Street, DuPont Circle, in jazz clubs like the Bohemian Caverns or Mr. Henry's, or art spaces like Jefferson Place or the Washington Gallery of Modern Art, and then finally the DuPont Center workshop where my dad and my mom worked from 69 to 72. So it tells the story, but then also points to work that was done in the year of DC's home rule charter. So the year of 1974, when we could vote for our mayor for the first time. And for in the life of my parents, it was the year they moved into the home where they live now, where we are right now. And it's the year that my dad was able to make art for himself, kind of, and write for himself and work for himself for the first time. So leading up to that with Lloyd and these collaborations, it was a very public kind of art practice. His studios were partly due to the nature of silk screen, a collaborative thing where my dad would print and then someone would help assist, move the paper, rack the paper on drying rack. So there was always activity, and then the nature of the work would go to exhibits, go to venues, go into the streets, on bus stops, on church walls, university walls. But when that workshop closed in 1972, there was this period of transition where my dad could, for the first time, kind of have this break and figure out what did he want. At the time, he was 38. What did he want his work to look like? What did he want the most? And what did his what kind of work did he most want to undertake? And so what happened was this series that is collected in the book called Of the Land, and it's for me so special because it's a series of prints, but also a series of drawings, and it's also a series of poetry, and they all intersect and connect, and they have in this way this quality of it's hard to say which kind of was the impetus or the energizing force for the other. They almost all kind of had to revolve, and so much of the work is about revolution in the sense of the natural year. They begin in early spring, the art and poetry cycle, and there are 12 prints, and they trace the whole so seasonal year, but then revolution in terms of what was happening in DC at the time, and DC in a fight for its own its own right for self-organization in terms of a local city administration. And so there's a lot to say also. I think for me, maybe more on a personal angle, when my parents moved into the home, it was kind of a neglected house, both inside and outside. And so one of the first things they did was build into the mud that surrounded the house as a path, and the path went all the way around. And so there's another element of a circle. And so it all kind of culminated with in that year, my dad finally building his studio. So they've worked kind of where we are in the living room, so throughout the house, and then kind of making a home for themselves. So I like to think of the work as kind of, as they were making a home for themselves, kind of in their home, they were also, DC was making a home for itself as its own city, with its own right to a democratically elected mayor, so its own home in the nation. And so I was thinking we could start with one poem that is the theme poem that puts all of this together, and it's called Of the Land. So what do you think of that, to start to read that?
I think that's fine. Of the land, the kindness of living amidst love's greening land is born of earth's sweet giving, of morning and evening and seasons. And knowing of this believing, seeing now the coming yield, break from heaven's great being, an exanthema of clouds. As spring becomes a leaving, and summer spirit holds love's stay, the bounty thus is falling, and winters bear the promise.
And I wonder if there are any questions too. I'm not sure if that's too. If hopefully that's not a challenge for as far as muting, unmuting. But if there are questions, that'd be great too. Or my dad can keep reading too, if that's okay. So do you want to?
Shall I continue reading?
Yeah.
The kindness of living is a poem written for a silkscreen print. And it goes, golden halo, yellow coming, ringing rounds of a rolling spring, whispering of willowed land, dreaming dreams of everything. Gently down, golden halo, yellow bearing, breathing hues of dawning hope, and kindness is that I intend. Sweetly now, golden halo, yellow giving, singing songs of everything.
And then this is. That's the piece of art for that particular piece. And then for the next is
Greening amidst love's land, shines a particular ray, just the slimmer of sun, which led me this way, then warmed the cool and stayed the day. Fulsome this wood grows wide and deep, a fortune enriched for loving's retreat. For seeing seas, my touching keep. This work is called Born Beyond Search. Sky clouds beginning, feather down, bringing up calm, above desire. Sky clouds rumble, deep with the restless, noiseless passing. Below meaning, sky clouds erupt over greenings. Born of earth's sweet giving, born of earth's sweet giving.
And then, so we do have a question. Can take a. I'm curious from Kim Roberts. I'm curious how the creative process of the visual art and poetry differed, and how they fed one another. What do you think of that?
That's good.
Do you want to?
Should I read?
Or do you want to say about how art and poetry differed for you, or is it all the same? Or
It's pretty much all the same. Sometimes I write before I start making the drawings. Other times I make the drawings and then I write. But either way, it's all interchanged. The poetry means the art, and the art means the poetry. This poem, Seasons, could in meaning springtime, a morning mist so mild, there mouthing daily birth time of loving's lovely child. Then enraptured others early sunshine is summer's time beguiled in calling sweeping chimes to loving's lovely pile. Good autumn's time is mimed through evening's mighty file to give the mind the best that's mine for living's while. Deep night must night enshrine round winter's distant mile. Winter's glory now divined in loving's lonely smile. This poem is called Believing Daisies, because you must believe in daisies. Sun-sheared, bough-broken, deep creasing stream spills riches and grass grows. A stealth of daisies comes softly, like living full sweetness, seeming all and love lands. The coming yield. I've known some fields, I'll bravely say, for I have sown an oak today. Call it 7, you'll hear me say, a direct route to my highway. Spirits high, help keep me gay, for I will surely earn my pay. I'll sow an oat each single day, and it helps to keep me on my way.
Should I turn to your favorite poem?
Sure.
Okay. So this is
It's called Promise. Promise. Winter's light of heaven's might bears its promise true of endless lands and chilly sands and skies of lighter blue. Big old tree that dreaming me bared its branches too, from summer's end and autumn's trend, remembrances of you. Free birth here, no plan to fear. Bare trees have their due. Of leaves in spring, sweet offering, and love I have for you.
well, thank you so much.
Thank you, Lou and Will Stovall. Let's give a big Zoom applause here. And Kim Roberts put the link where you can go and find that book that they were reading from into the chat. So avail yourself of that. Our next presenter is Maryland's 10th Poet Laureate, Grace Cavalieri, who is the author of numerous poetry books and chapbooks. She's written several short form and full-length plays. Her latest poetry books are The Secret Letters of Madame de Stael, Grace Art Poems and Paintings, What the Psychic Said, and Showboat, about 25 years as a Navy wife. Her latest play, Quilting the Sun, was produced at the Theater for the New City up in New York in 2019. She is the founder and producer of The Poet and the Poem for public radio, now from the Library of Congress, celebrating 45 years on air. Grace holds several awards and distinctions, among them the AWP's George Garrett Award, the Penn Syndicated Fiction, and many, many others. So she's here with us today to share her knowledge of John McNally. And I'm also interested in hearing about The Poet and the Poem, Going to the Moon. So Grace, let's hear all about it.
Thank you, Henry. You are a gift to Washington. Thank you so much. I do want to talk about John McNally, whose name was actually William John McNally III, because he was a great innovator and he started so many initiatives and did not take credit for any of them. He was very modest. And of course, we're here because he co-founded the Washington Writers Publishing House with me 40 years ago. And his name should be said out loud. He died in 2020. He was 76 years of age. John had begun poets in the schools in Virginia in the 70s. He also began concerned officers for peace with John Kerry, protesting the Vietnam War. That's where my husband became connected with him. He actually was a great innovator. And I want to give just a moment of his bio. He said he was an Army brat and was raised in Arizona, Hawaii, Japan, all over the place. And he went to Duke and to study history. Now, after that, he joined the Navy and became a lieutenant in the Navy. And he was one of those people who were on the riverboats with John Kerry, which was a terrible deployment. He would say that he didn't talk much about it, but he did tell my husband that dead bodies would fall on him in the boat. He's such a gentle man. It was hard to imagine. When he got shore duty, he was in the Bureau of Navy Personnel with my husband, and Ken was his superior officer. So we used to joke and call John our inferior officer. And being a bachelor, he would come to dinner about once a week because he was hungry. And Ken and I got to know him very well. He was writing poetry, and we just clicked, and we wrote poetry together and talked about it. And of course, he was extremely discouraged because there was no one to publish him. And it hasn't changed much, but he believed that we should just put our shoulder to the wheel and make it possible for other poets. So he had this idea of starting a collective, because you may remember in the 70s, everything was communes and collectives. And he figured if we could get 3 poets published, then they would be committed to run the organization and get 3 more poets published. Then they would be committed, and we would have an inverted pyramid where each one would enter the organization and work for its fulfillment. So the first group of poems, of course, we published ourselves because what's the use of having a publishing house if you don't do that? The first group, Deirdre Baldwin was in it. And I think early on was Terrence Winch and Ethelbert Miller. And it was really a lot of fun. We paid for the first books out of pocket. And then we started actually selling. Now, we didn't know what to do with the books after they were published. So I would take a ride into town with Robert, and he would double park in front of a bookstore, and I would run in and put the books on the shelf, and then they would sell the books, and then our poets will get read. We called it the drop and split method, and it worked very well. And I said, I don't know why people worry about distribution so much. It's quite easy. You just need to have someone double park. So we had a very exciting friendship and time. Robert Sargent became the next president. And then, of course, Gene Nordhaus, who's here today, picked it up in its shambles, and for a decade restored it to a healthy, thriving publishing house. It now has so many titles, and on June 5th, it's going to celebrate a 40-year occasion. So John was the one who was the brains behind that. And while we were doing this, he had to go off to the University of Virginia Law School. When he came back to DC, he was still active in poetry. He published Northern Lights. He read with many lawyers in public venues. And he was an active part of our poetry scene. Then he moved to Vermont. Oh, I have to say, when he was in DC, he argued before the Supreme Court. That's very cool for a poet. And then he the mountains were always calling him, he said. So he married Margaret Cheney, and she, no relation to the other Cheneys, to Liz. She was a writer on the Washingtonian magazine and very literary, and they moved to Vermont. They had 3 children, Jimmy, Catherine, and Peter, and I'm happy to say that Jim is with us today. I'm so glad you made it, Jim. And he had a thriving lawyer firm in Vermont. He and Margaret separated, and she did marry the representative from Vermont, Peter Welch. John went on, besides being a successful lawyer and poet, to be a very great artist. He is really known for his art in Vermont, and he is hanging in many galleries and is a world-class artist, so beautiful. So he was instrumental in many things, and yet his name was never said, and I say it now. I'm going to read a couple of his poems that he wrote long ago, between maybe when he was like between 30 and 40 years of age. And I'm going to start with the one for Jimmy, who is here with us, and it's called Jim at 5 months. I don't know if you remember this, Jim, or even ever heard it. Jim at 5 months, straining for something. What is its name? What are the questions? What is this game? You search for the word that you know exists, the name of my hat, the name of your eye, the names of creatures that fly in the sky, that thing with a tail that looks like a squirrel, the shimmer of traffic, the racket of crows. Lord only knows you would speak if you could and tell us how life is so new in the world for a pearly bud, a leaf just uncurled. Here's one called After Heracletus. We are condemned by everything we do to move forward always, never repeating the past, unable to do once more what we did before in exactly the same way. Conditions have changed, as they say. A slight drop in the barometric pressure, bacteria grown in a glass, visibility down, your hat left at home on the table. Things have their way. Gravitation curves away moment by moment as particles whirl in their solemn romance. The earth has turned 2 million miles in space, as you were reading, not heeding the sound of your blood that rushes each day while you travel from morning to afternoon. Each moment is precious, but no more so than the one before or the one ahead. Take courage, trust in something larger than your own existence. Walk with open arms into the future, which is receding behind you, wherever you go. And two more. He loved psychoanalysis, and he thinks it made law better, and it certainly made art better. So I'm going to read Looking Backward. After 25 years of analysis, the child returns home, dim furniture, mother and father there in the living room, lost in the same stunned silence. How the wind still twists in the evening branches, going into the kitchen. A plate of cookies sits by the window, overlooking a lawn where dolls and baseball gloves lay covered with dew. I won't bore you with the ensuing story. It was like watching a movie in which the characters never grew, or upending a glass-covered dome and watching the snow fall slowly through wintry air. The scene could be anywhere, a landscape appearing each place I go. Tiny figures, church steeple, white picket fence, and the mute, unending snow. And I'm going to read a poem I wrote for John, not long before he died. It's called Enlightenment, for John McNally. To be at peace, I am told to know there is no other world outside myself. This is the only world. That attachment equals aversion for its fixed point of view. There is nothing but love, the only state of being. The Buddhists say I should be mindful when I eat for the sun and soil and all that brought it, to walk slowly with meditative steps to reach my destination, to be with nature, to water seeds of joy every day. They are always waiting. I am told that I can hold my suffering like a small child and claim and calm the world. To know compassion for either side of the gun. I think of Yeats, things reveal themselves passing away, that emotions come and go, then let them. They depend on the wind, the weather, the sound of the rain. But as I sip my tea, poured from death's cafe, writing with a borrowed pen, my feelings are fireflies that gather in the sky, and under the slivered moon, I want the hand of tenderness, remembering the poet who wrote and said, do what you can with this. And John was the hand of tenderness from beginning to end, never raised his voice, but so sweet and so powerful. I wish he will lie and rest with his poetry and paintings, along with the other people we are honoring today, all of whom I knew and worked with Askia for 20 years and loved Judith Farr so much. And I think they're all on tape except for Greg Tate, who went off to New York to the Rolling Stone. So John McNally, we say your name because it was not said before. and it was not even known that it was the Washington Writers Publishing House was your idea. So you're finally getting the credit 40 years later. I'm going to switch gears now because I told Myra she was going to the moon, and she was quite happy about that. And so she wanted to know why and how. And maybe she'd rather go to Texas, but I couldn't help it. This is what we're doing. It started because I'm on the staff of Poets and Artists magazine, or I work with them. And Didi Menendez knew a physicist whose name is San Peralta, who is curating 91 countries to put their art in a capsule, like everything, 91 countries he's curating for paintings and poems, and it's going on a quarter, a size, something this big. And it will be in a capsule to launched from NASA in July on the Lunar Codex. So he heard the poet and the poem and he loved it. And he said, I would like to put the first podcast series on the moon. So all of you, most of you are going because of Jen King. If it were not for Jen King, I want to say, she took my archives and put it on the website at GW. And if she did not, you all would not be digitized and we would not go to the ocean of storms, which is where we're going to land in the dust together with Bach and Andy Warhol. I think they're proper companions to travel with. So if it were not for Jen, we wouldn't have the digitized, they would be lost because you can only tape digitized material and not the tapes that she has, you know. So the Library of Congress relieved its website of my archive because they only want things featured that are produced by their paid personnel at the library, which is, you can understand it, but I was panicky that we would lose these people. So they're there. And if anyone wants to know who's going to the moon, please do not call me at 3 o'clock in the morning. Just go to gracecavalieri.com and on the left message bar, at the very top, it says archive, the poet and the poem archive from the Library of Congress. If you read those words, don't call me, click that and you'll see the archive of a couple hundred maybe poets. And then under that is a list of names. They're all going to the moon. So I don't know how many, I haven't counted, but just the ones we could digitize, which again, Jan helped do. She got funding and we're hoping to digitize as many as we can. So Myra said, we'll just quickly go over where the poet and the poem started. We'll say from DC to the moon. And I think I can do this in 3 minutes. I was teaching in Antioch from 70 to 75. And then, oh yes, I have 4 minutes. And then I heard of a new station going on the air because it had been in litigation for 9 years because it was so progressive that Congress was holding it back. But a student of mine was volunteering and she said they needed a drama and literature director. And how wacky would that be? I thought, this is just for me. This is such a wacky thing, a radio station with a drama and literature director. So here we go. I'd quit WPFW to raise money. I quit Antioch to raise money for WPFW from 75 to 77. And I just want you to know that if you do anything, get the money. If you get the money, you can do anything. And that nice Leonard Randolph at NEA, remember him? He gave me $40,000. And for that, we had I had 8 programs a week and they were pretty awesome. One was writing workshops on the air, which we actually had manuscripts from the audience and writers critiquing them. I got Prince George's Community College to give 3 credits to these people who did it. But that did not go well because it turned out the writers did not like to be trashed on 200,000 volts. So we had a lot of backlash about that. So we concluded Writers on the Air. But the poet and the poem stayed. And in 20 years, I thought these poets should go national, that they were such DC is just the poetry capital of the world. And now, of course, it's going to be intergalactic. So I went to the Library of Congress because I needed a stable studio where everyone wasn't a volunteer. And Nancy Galbraith said she'd take it if she could be the host. And so I thought, well, if that's what it takes. So she did one program and then she didn't want to do it anymore because she had to read all those books, and then she had this big job at the poetry office. So I went forward, and we're 25 years there now, celebrating 45 years. And that is the story of the poet and the poem from DC to the moon in July. And we've recorded about 3,000 poets. I bet 1,000 could be at GW, our main archive. Some are at Harvard, University of California at Irvine, the Library of Congress, and Pacifica. In closing, if you want to make permanent audio material, the point is you get it on as many places as you can, for when it fades out one place, some will be left another place. It is just that hectic and random. So I'm so happy to be here. First of all, to throw a kiss to John McNally and to say hi to James, his son, who himself is a recent father. And to thank Henry and the poetry community, all of whom have kept the poet and the poem where it's going to the moon. Everyone has put their energy behind the poet and the poem for 45 years. So thank you.
Grace Cavalieri, let's give her a warm Zoom applause there. A true gift to our area in poetry. And I'll see you on the moon there, Grace. So now we talk about one gift to the area. Now we'll go and discuss another one, because I'm going to introduce Kim Roberts, who is the editor of the anthology By Broad Potomac Shore, Great Poems from the Early Days of Our Nation's Capital, which was selected by the DC Public Library and the East Coast Centers for the book for the 2021 Route 1 Reads program, as the book that best illuminates important aspects of the culture of Washington, DC. She is the author of A Literary Guide to Washington, DC, Walking in the Footsteps of American Writers, from Francis Scott Key to Zora Neale Hurston, and 5 books of poems, most recently, The Scientific Method. A 6th book, Corona Crown, a cross-disciplinary collaboration with photographer Robert Revere, is forthcoming as a chapbook from WordTech Editions in 2023. So let's give a warm Zoom welcome to Kim Roberts, who will share her deep knowledge of DC area poetry, past and present. Kim, welcome to our Zoom stage.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. And I want to also say a special thank you to Myra Sklarou, who has given such leadership to this Splendid Wake group, and just who is the spirit of generosity. So thank you, Myra, and Henry, and everyone else who contributed to make this program. So I just wanted to say a few words in general about the anthology that I put together, and then read a few poems. So the anthology, as Henry said, is by Broad Potomac Shore. And I have been doing research over the past 35 years into who are our poetic forebears. And so the anthology covers poets who are active in the city from the city's founding in 1800 through about the beginnings of modernism, so until about 1930. I was thrilled that it got honored in the city in the midst of the pandemic. So you may or may not have heard the news, but the DC Public Library and the East Coast Centers for the Book included it last year in Route 1 Reads. And I put a link in the chat to that. That's an initiative of the 16 centers for the book that go from Maine down to Florida. Each state picks a book each year that is meant to represent that state, or in our case, not a state, the district. It was just such an honor for my book to be selected. Myra said she was interested in where I did the research, and I have to say, when I first started researching the poets that I include in the book, I had to go to archives. I had to go to the Moreland Spingarn archives and the archives at the Library of Congress and the Washingtoniana room at the DC Public Library. Now so much is digitized, but of course I'm still sort of addicted to going to archives. And alas, even though the book is published, I'm still finding new poets. You know, the reason why you would bother to put together a new anthology is not to simply reinforce the choices other people have made, right? I wanted to question the canon. So the book does include some people whose names you would recognize. The name By Broad Potomac's Shore comes from a poem by Walt Whitman. There are certainly, you know, well-established poets in the book, but I was particularly interested in finding poets who I think are their work is just as strong as the poets who are regularly read and studied in school, but are less well known. And they're usually less well known because they were women, working class poets, poets of color, queer poets. So you know, I would read through the archives of one poet and you go through their correspondence and it leads you on to other, you know, who are the other poets who are part of their community. So it's just been such a pleasure to find these forebears. And I really do think that I've found some lesser known poets who are just as deserving as the poets who are currently in the canon. So I wanted to read, in the little remaining time I have, read 4 poems. I looked for poets, and these are 4 women poets, it turned out. I looked for poets who were commenting specifically on important aspects of their time period. I looked for poets who mention particular locales in DC. Many of the poets would fit that description. Of course, not all, not everyone wrote about the news. But this poet that I wanted to start with, Sarah Bryan Piatt, her husband worked for the government and had a career of different jobs for the US government. And she was part of this sort of literate group of federal clerks and their spouses. So she was actually, she knew Walt Whitman. This poem of hers is called April at Washington, and it is very much a poem commenting on what it was like to be in the center of the action during the Civil War. April at Washington by Sarah Morgan Bryan Piatt. O whispering phantom and fair of the April of 2 years, in the delicate air, how strange are the pictures you show. I see you with triumph that sounds in the cannon and flashes in light, glide over these blossoming grounds through the crowded rejoicing at night. And I see you where steel is reversed, to the funeral's drums stifled beats, to the thought of a murder accursed, to the bugle's long wail down the streets, to the dust under bells moving slow, with the weight of a people's great grief, among flags falling dark draped and low, to the dead march behind the lost chief, who was wrapped in your beautiful hours as he passed to his glory and rest, his coffin lid sweet with your flowers and his last human look in your breast. I think it's an amazing tribute poem for Abraham Lincoln. And then moving forward in time, I wanted to read a poem by Esther Popple, who her married name was Esther Popple Shaw. Bear with me as I find the right page. Here we go. Esther Popple Shaw was a contemporary of a lot of the Harlem Renaissance era poets. And she was the review editor for the Journal of Negro Education, wrote for the Opportunity Crisis, a lot of the top journals that the Harlem Renaissance writers were publishing in. And yet her name is just totally unknown at this point. And I wanted to read her shocking, remarkable poem called Flag Salute, which I think is really rather contemporary. You see a lot of poets now are reusing texts and sort of cutting and pasting into texts. And so she uses the Pledge of Allegiance in that way with a contemporary news story, which I think will be, I don't think it needs my introduction. Flag salute. I pledge allegiance to the flag. They dragged him naked through the muddy streets, a feeble-minded Black boy, and the charge, supposed assault upon an aged woman of the United States of America. 1 mile they dragged him like a sack of meal, a rope around his neck, a bloody ear left dangling by the patriotic hand of Nordic youth, a boy of 17, and to the republic for which it stands. And then they hanged his body to a tree below the window of the county judge, whose pleadings for that battered human flesh were stifled by the brutish, raucous howls of men and boys and women with their babes brought out to see the bloody spectacle of murder in the style of 33. 3,000 strong they were, one nation, indivisible. To make the tale complete, they built a fire. What matters that the stuff they burned was flesh and bone and hair and reeking gasoline. With liberty and justice, they cut the rope in bits and passed them out for souvenirs among the men and boys. The teeth, no doubt, on golden chains will hang about the favored necks of sweethearts, wives, and daughters, mothers, sisters, babies too, for all. So that, these poems that can address things like the history of lynching in this country, you can't help but read them and have them resonate with Black Lives Matter, with our own struggles today. But of course, not all the poems in the book are so overtly political. So I wanted to read 2 love poems to you. Natalie Clifford Barney. Let me find her page. I did mark these pages. Here we go. So Natalie Clifford Barney was an expatriate poet who lived most of her adult life in Paris. And she spent her childhood in DC. Her mother was very prominent socialite and a painter. And I think that she's less well known because she wrote so much of her work in French, and so much of it has not been well translated. But her work is incredible. And in 1900, she wrote some portrait sonnets of women, becoming the first woman poet to write openly about lesbian love since Sappho. So I wanted to read a poem of hers called More Night. And of course, nighttime is the time that we tend to associate with romance. More night, moon love, star love, the love of silver water, the weeping face of love touched in the dark, and murdered joy, lost souls of joy that caught her a glowworm's warmth and spark. Birds of prey invisible now hover about her midnights hammocked in unrest. A moving shadow, faithless as a lover, is all her arms have pressed. Too luminous the dreaming of the sleeper, whose tears are prophecies and second sight. Has death no undersea, no darkness deeper, in which to satiate our need of night? I wish she was better known. And then another Harlem Renaissance era poet whose work has been particularly influential to me. I wanted to read a short poem by Georgia Douglas Johnson, who ran a salon in her home. Actually, both she and Natalie Clifford Barney are notable as being the hosts of salons and encouraging other writers. So Georgia Douglas Johnson, this is a short love poem of hers called Pledge. With kisses, I'll awake you, love, so tenderly at morn, the pledges of my fealty, diurnally reborn. We'll thread life's way together, love, and when the fading light drifts softly over western hills, I'll kiss your eyes good night. So that gives you just a little taste of the sort of range that's in the book. Thank you again. I'll turn it back over to Henry.
Kim Roberts, what a gift you are to our community, to its history, to its poetry. I'm going to take some questions now, but first, right out of the box, we have a great question from Jonah Colson, who asked, was the Flag Salute poem published during her life? And that's a poem that's directed to Kim.
Sure. The answer is yes, but it was not widely known because it was published in a book of hers that was from, she published the book herself. So it was a book that was distributed among friends and it made it into a few library collections, but is really just one of these lost books that it takes your breath away. You know, that I was able to find a copy and her work is stunning. And as you say, Jonah, you know, strikingly modern.
Thank you very much, Kim. All right, so I think we have time for just a couple of questions. And all right, and we're going to be doing this more or less on the fly. So please, if you encounter chaos, please be please be mindful. So let's see if you have any questions or comments. If you have a question and would like to speak, please use the raise hand feature and we'll call on you. To raise your hand, if you're on a computer, click reactions, then click on the raised hand. If you dialed in on a phone, just press *9 to raise your hand. And so feel free if you see if we have anybody who wants to raise their hand and ask a question. Okay, Patricia G. Brian, would you unmute her?
Well, I think I'm unmuted now. Patricia Gray is the name. Hi, Henry. And hi, everybody. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry to miss the first part of this program, but Kim, what a remarkable job of research and digging. And it's just astonishing that you put that together. Thank you so much for doing that. And also, Grace, you're our angel. You're sending us all to the moon. Thanks.
Okay, Indrin. All right, are you unmuted?
You hear me now?
A little bit. See, speak again. Yeah, I think you're having some trouble with your microphone.
Can you hear me now?
No.
Not really, just barely, but
Let me try one other thing. Can you hear me now?
we're getting a little bit better, but you're too faint. What is your question? And let me see if I can redirect it. No, I can't hear it at all. Sorry. Okay, do we have anybody else with a question while Indran is trying to get some sound going on his Oh, Indran, yeah. Put the question in the chat and I'll direct it.
Henry,
Okay.
I think Myra was trying to signal to you.
Okay, I think we have the question here. What is particular about the poetry written in the DMV as opposed to other regions of the country? And I think that could go out to Grace, Kim, and Lou Stovall. So all three of you just take a quick stab at that. And then I think we're going to have to conclude this question period. But that's a good question. What in particular about the poetry written in the DMV as opposed to other regions? Kim, you want to get us started?
Oh, my. Well, I can only talk from my limited experience, but I think, you know, of course, one of the things that makes us different is that our town is different, right? So many of us work for the federal government or work for contractors to the federal government. It's our major industry. We get the kind of scrutiny that only a capital city would get. And yet, since we're not known for the arts, we get the sort of underdog status. From my personal experience, I've lived in several different cities before I settled here. And I think it's a particularly generous community. I think other places I've lived, there's been a lot of competition and more of a sense of, you know, there's limited resources and I should not be sharing them with others. And I have found the opposite to be true here, that people are really very open and generous, which I can only guess is because of that underdog status, that, you know, we become our own audience because if we don't support one another, it's all government all the time. I don't know. Do you have another take on that, Grace?
I also agree with you that it is a very interesting sense of family in Washington. But I've always said we were the poetry capital of the world. Well, actually, we have 5 universities with poets that come through that. We have a number of small presses. And we have the greatest proponent of African-American poets proportionately in the country. Our poets in the African-American community in DC really are nationally known, nationally published, and have been in the cutting edge of poetry. So I think that's a significant difference. But I want to reinforce what you said, Kim, because when you see the other communities, they're such sharks in New York, you know, they're all stepping on one another to get up another rung. From the beginning, there was an unsaid feeling and commitment among the poets, I think since the 60s, that wasn't us, you know, that we just weren't going to go there. And I think that Myra will support this, and Jean Nordhaus and others, that there has never been a real crisis, a literary crisis. So we're more like a family. Maybe it is, as you say, because we're discreet and in the shadow of the Capitol, as they say. But I think it's the most beautiful place in the world for poetry, and it will last. Our poems will last longer than, I think. Well, of course, they're going to be on the moon, so that's one thing.
Okay. Lou Stovall, what do you think of what's special about writing poetry in the DMV?
Yeah, what do you think?
Oh, I don't know what I think. I think we have a wonderful community of thinkers and writers and so on. And I think that it's wonderful for all of us to not mind reading our poetry to others and getting comments back. So I don't have a specific desire or to read at this particular moment, but I thank everyone for their ability to share.
Thank you. Thank you, Lou Stovall. Okay, well, I think we got to move on from questions. And we have actually, at this point in our program, a very special presentation by Myra Skleroux, who has worked tirelessly over the years to present these Splendid Wake programs. Today, she would like to talk about the situation in the Ukraine and the history and future of Splendid Wake. Myra, please come up and step into our Splendid Wake Zoom stage. Myra Skleroux. Got to unmute yourself. There you go.
Okay.
Yep.
Let me get rid of this. Thank you very, very much, Henry, for guiding us. Our grateful thanks to all who have made this program possible today and since 2011, when it first began, to Jennifer King and the Special Collections Research Center at the GW University Gelman Library, to Elisa Vieta Ritchie, who invented its name and concept, to the Splendid Wake Committee, whose members work so hard to bring this effort into reality and to sustain it, to Jacqueline Jules, Henry Crawford, Karen Alanier, Joanna Howard, who coordinated the programs for many years, to all those who volunteered to make the archive, blog, wiki, and public programs possible. Splendid Wake was founded to document poets, poetry movements, and literary organizations in the DC area from 1900 to the present. It was clear at the time of its founding that the remarkable history was disappearing. The generations of Sterling Brown and May Miller, May Miller's father, Kelly Miller, Sterling Brown's father, remarkable people, the writings of those whom Kim Roberts has so beautifully included in her anthology. Our featured poets this evening are quite remarkable in the scope of their talents and the capacity to work in multiple disciplines and in fostering the works of others. Grace Cavalieri is an accomplished playwright, an artist, a poet, and one who has never stopped major contributions to the community. Among these, through her interviews with writers, the poet and the poem, now recorded at the Library of Congress and soon on their way to the moon. I think that's absolutely a wonderful, wonderful happening. Artist and poet Lou Stovall painted the work, printed the work in silkscreen and other invented forms of many artists at his workshop, established in 1968 and operated until 2020, and collaborated with Sam Gilliam and many other artists. His son, Will Stovall, artist and scholar, is the editor of their remarkable book, Of the Land, the Art and Poetry of Lou Stovall, which includes silkscreens, drawings, poetry and prose, My words do not begin to tell you of the moving power of this book. We come now to what may be the final public program of A Splendid Wake, unless some enthusiastic souls are out there to carry on the work. However, books and papers may still be contributed to the Washington Writers' Archives at the Gelman Library at GW. And I'll be glad to put the website up for you. I'd like to conclude with words by Ilya Kaminsky, American poet born in 1977 in Odessa, at that time under Soviet Russia, now part of Ukraine, from his introduction, Barometers, to a book out recently called Words for War, New Poems from Ukraine. He came to America in his teens. What exactly is the poetry's witness? The language of poetry may or may not change us, but it shows the changes within us. Like a seismograph, it registers violent occurrences. Milosz titled his seminal text, The Witness of Poetry, not because we witness it, but because it witnesses us. Living on the other side of the Iron Curtain, Zbigniew Herbert told us something similar. A poet is like a barometer for the psyche of a nation. It cannot change the weather, but it shows us what the weather is like. And he concludes with, living among hundreds of miles, living many hundreds of miles from Ukraine, away from this war in my comfortable American backyard, what right do I have to write about this war? And yet I cannot stop writing about it, cannot stop mulling over the words by poets of my country in English, this language they do not speak. Why this obsession between sentences in the silence I do not control, even though it is a different language, the silence between sentences is still the same. It is the space in which I see a family still huddled by the doorframe at 4 a.m., debating whether or not to open the door to a stranger wearing only his pajamas who is shouting through the doorframe. And that memory, which happened in his childhood, has been with him ever since, when they sought refuge during his teenage years. I think one of the most important things is how we respond and how we help, and how we go on living our normal lives while we see what's happening in that region. And I thank you all more than I have said for your participation all these years in A Splendid Wake. Thank you.
Thank you, Myra Skleroux. Okay, I think it is time to bring these proceedings to an end. For me, poetry is more a way of life than a literary activity, and today we have borne witness to the remarkable poets who have inhabited our nation's capital, to those who have passed on, and particularly those whose lives were cut too short. A Splendid Wake is a way of saying you are not forgotten. But what better way to celebrate living poetry than to watch a father and son carry this art form down the generations, or to be witness to a poetry program being carried to the moon, or to bring alive the work of those who were there at the founding of this city and who produced works on the ground upon which we now stand. I want to thank everyone on the Splendid Wake team for their hard work in putting this program together. And I also want to thank everyone for coming out and joining us today. And I want to wish you the best in all of your endeavors in this coming year. Thank you all, and stay safe.